Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 7 about the judicial branch. It's Lesson 7 about judicial structure. In this lesson, you'll learn about U.S. district courts, about U.S. circuit courts, the United States Supreme Court, and about state courts. The United States Constitution, in Article 3, says that there'll be a Supreme Court of the United States. So that's where we'll begin constructing a diagram of the structure of the American court system. So the judicial structure we can begin to illustrate on this page by first adding a box that will represent the United States Supreme Court. There is only a single Supreme Court for the United States. Now, that may seem obvious, but I just wanted to point out the number because we're going to look at the numbers of the other courts that are part of our American federal court system also. After the United States Constitution says that there'll be a Supreme Court of the United States, it also says that there'll be additional courts, described as inferior courts, in other words, courts below the Supreme Court, as Congress from time to time will decide that there should be and then create. So if we go back to our diagram with our United States Supreme Court there, we can then add the United States district courts that Congress has created. These are the courts at the bottom of the federal judicial system. They are courts of original jurisdiction, as you've learned that concept in a previous lesson. In other words, they're the courts where trials take place concerning someone, for example, who has broken a law of the United States of America. There are 94 United States district courts that have been created by the United States Congress that are currently in operation. There's another layer of court that has also been created by the United States Congress called the Circuit Courts of Appeal. There are 13 of these courts, and their relationship with the United States District Courts is to sort of watch over them. So if we remove the numbers from our diagram, we can then proceed to look at the relationships that these courts have with each other. When you have a case before a United States District Court to be tried, if you don't like the outcome of that trial, you can appeal your case up to the Circuit Court of Appeals that presides over that district court. Now remember from a previous lesson, when you appeal that case up, you aren't really going to be challenging the facts that were decided by the jury in your trial. Instead, you're going to be challenging whether or not the law was correctly applied in your case. If you then don't like the decision that you get from the Circuit Court of Appeals, you can potentially appeal your case up to the United States Supreme Court. Now that's a little more difficult, as we'll explain in a future lesson, but it is a possibility that's open. So now let's look at a map that shows how these various levels of courts fit in with each other. Here's a map of the United States, and obviously the United States Supreme Court has authority over everything on this map. Then the map is divided up into circuit courts. Each of these different colored areas of the country, with a number and a black circle within it, represents one of the circuit courts of appeal. So for example, the western United States is covered by the Ninth Circuit. The extreme northeast of the United States is covered by the First Circuit. Now you may notice that the numbers sort of follow a pattern as you go across the country, with some weird exceptions. You start out in the northeast corner with 1, then you move to 2, and you get down to Pennsylvania, that area 3, and then the Mid-Atlantic states 4, and then the Deep South you're at 11. The reason is because at one point all the Deep South, from Texas to Florida, was in the Fifth Circuit. That eventually, when things got too big, was split into 2 circuits. By then, there were already 10 others in the country, and so the new circuit had to be labeled the 11th. Same thing out west. There was a Ninth Circuit, which is eventually divided to create the 10th Circuit also. And so the 10th Circuit is actually farther east than the Ninth. Then if you look within the circuits themselves, you can see that some of the states are divided up. For example, you look down in Texas, and you can see the little dashed lines, dotted lines, moving across Texas that have divided Texas up into 4 chunks. Each of those represents the boundaries of one of the federal district courts, an area covered by that trial court. Every state has at least one district court. Many states are divided up into 2, 3, or even 4 district courts that have different areas that they cover. So now let's return to our diagram. So in the federal court system, which we've completely diagrammed now, let me remind you at the bottom we have the district courts, in other words the trial courts, and then above them we have a layer of appeals courts called the circuit courts of appeal, and then above them a single Supreme Court. This basic structure is then mirrored by the states. In each state you'll have a layer of courts that conduct trials. Above them you'll have a layer of courts that hear appeals. So if you don't like the decision you get in a state trial court, you can appeal it up to the state appellate court. You can say, hey, the state trial court applied the laws of that particular state incorrectly. Now, something I want to make clear about here. The national court system is dealing with issues of national law. The state court systems are dealing with issues of state law. Then, if you don't like the decision that you got from the state appeals court, you have another layer above it, which we can call state Supreme Courts. Now, we have to be careful. I'm using kind of generic names here because different states name their courts different things. For example, in New York State, for whatever crazy reason, they call their state Supreme Court the Court of Appeals. And then even more crazier, they call their state trial courts Supreme Courts. Don't get hung up on the actual names. Just realize that in every state there's going to be a level of courts where they conduct trials, a level of courts where they have appeals, and then there'll be some sort of Supreme Court at the top. If you don't like the decision that you've gotten from the appellate court in the state, then you can appeal up to the state Supreme Court. But remember, this whole process is about the violation of the laws of that state, not about the laws of the United States of America. If your case involves laws of the United States of America, you're going to be over there in the national court system instead. Now, there is one possible way to jump from one court system to the other, represented by this dashed blue arrow that I've added. You can jump from the one court system to the other if your case raises a federal question. You hopefully can recall this idea of a federal question from a previous lesson. But for right now at this moment, just realize that what's being said here is whatever the state is doing to you is something that somehow violates some law of the country. So when you make the transition over, you're saying that the state's behavior is now violating one of these federal issues. So let me remind you what those federal questions are. A federal question concerns the Constitution of the United States of America, or the laws of the United States of America, or treaties of the United States of America. So, to make the jump from state courts to federal courts, you must claim that the actions of your state are raising a federal question. In other words, you say, hey, when the state stopped me for that traffic ticket, and then took me to court and prosecuted me for it, and then I appealed and my conviction was upheld, and then I went to the state Supreme Court and my conviction was upheld, what they were doing to me in some way either violated the Constitution of the United States of America, or a law of the United States of America, or a treaty of the United States of America. So the way this might work is, let's say a state court prosecutes you for murder, and they have as evidence a gun that was used to kill the person. Well, you might eventually, even if the state convicts you, and then you lose on appeal, and you lose on your appeal to the state Supreme Court, you might eventually still be able to appeal your case to the United States Supreme Court, because you might be able to claim that the state, in presenting that gun as evidence against you in trial, had actually violated the United States Constitution's prohibition against unreasonable searches, because you might claim they found the gun in your apartment by searching without a search warrant. That's the kind of thing where you can make the jump from the state courts to the national court system by claiming a federal question. But if you don't have something like that in your case, and you're being tried in state courts for violation of a state law, I'm sorry, you're stuck there. No federal question, you are stuck in the state courts. Now let's review what you learned in this lesson. What are federal trial courts called? Are they called superior courts, magistrate courts, circuit courts, or district courts? They are called district courts. What are federal appellate courts called? Are they called superior courts, magistrate courts, circuit courts, or district courts? They are called circuit courts, or the more full name, circuit courts of appeal. What kind of federal court is created by the Constitution? Is it a Supreme Court, a district court, a circuit court, or are all of the above created by the Constitution? In fact, only the Supreme Court is created by the Constitution. The other kinds of courts in the national court system are created by Congress at their discretion. What issue can take a case from state court into a federal court? Is it if it has a factual error? Is it if it involves a congressman? Is it if it violates state law? Or is it if it raises a federal question? A case can make the jump from state courts to federal courts if they raise a federal question. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 7. It'll be Lesson 8 about the United States Supreme Court.